three-part panel, an open panel that Roz Williams and I organized on racialized technologics. And we are now going to be hearing from our fearless co-host with presenting a paper titled Mixed Unmatched Transplant Histocompatibility and the Problematic Mixed Race Body.
Thank you, Anne. Okay. Right. So first of all, I need to share this screen. For those of you who were not here this morning, just when it was disastrous. But the intellectual quality was fantastic, but the delivery through the equipment less so. So hopefully things will go a bit smoother now we're all in the room together. And right. Let's close that. Okay. Zoom. Share screen. Okay, rocket, it works. Cool, so I'll get started. So this builds on one part of a larger project about the relationship between race and stem cell or bone marrow registries, which some of you may have heard of. And the project itself, the larger project, was sparked by an interest in how ideas of mixedness or racial multiplicity in one body are being understood in contemporary biomedicine. So notions of racial mixedness have a long history tied up in very multiple projects of trying to order, to distinguish, and to value bodies. And these point towards processes of racialization, namely the affirmation of categories, of types, of kinds that are being merged. So in this paper, I'm primarily going to be talking about the UK context of this idea of mixedness. So in the UK, we might describe people as being mixed race. And I'm very conscious that has a local tenor to it that probably shares important consonances with, but is distinctive from other geographic spaces where ideas of racial transgression have a multiplicity of their own histories. So, for example, South Africa and Zimbabwe, or South and Central American context, as well as we saw in the first session from Andras's work, and which are all tied up, of course, in their own long histories of European imperialism. Okay, so whilst what we might think of today as a mixed race body has existed for as long as the notion of distinct races has, in places like the US and the UK, the mixed or multiple census category is considered to be the most swiftly growing racial or ethnic demographic category. So there's much to be cautious of in this framing of a demographic boom. Not least the claim to the increase of mixed-raced people as opposed to the increase of mixed identity. So this narrative of demographic boom has been visible in public discourse for many years now in the UK, and I will return to it in the context of transplantation, but I'd like just to focus particularly on the contemporary discursive framing of this boom. So as with any border, anxieties over the transgression thus made possible, but has been a kind of a discursive staple in relation to the mixed race body, as some of you may know. So an attention towards the historical tendency towards pathologization is evident in the critical literature. People talk of tragic mulattoes, melancholy hybrids. These became tropes in the 19th and 20th century as the result of fascination with the problems inherent in the mixing of supposedly separate races. And one could trace a concern with preventing crossbreeding that in its various articulations was concerned with the dilution of the pure white race, with a tangential interest in the welfare of the mixed subject, liminal and struggling for identity, as in the framing of the multiracial subject as marginal in the term of the marginal man. At moments, particularly more contemporarily, this is supplanted by an ostensibly more positive reading of the mixed subject as healthily vigorous, which is prominent particularly in geneticized discourse at the top there, mixed race relationships making us taller and smarter, children born to genetically diverse parents and more intelligent than their ancestors runs the headline. But this kind of genetic blending is kind of equivalent with vitality in this discourse. Again, in the UK, reality television has played a significant role in producing male racial mixedness, particularly black-white mixedness, as an aesthetic type to which generally white women seem to be drawn. A big thing about white women saying mixed race men are my type, whatever that means. That said, though, that thread of pathologization continues to resonate in the cultural sphere, predominantly surrounding how the mixed subject is forever going to be stuck between communities and therefore without their own community. Consider, for example, this political commentator, Trevor Phillips, who evinces political neuroses surrounding the community-based impacts of the apparent demographic boom I just mentioned of mixed-race people in the UK as the most troubled social category, marooned, he says, between communities there at the bottom. And I want to return to this idea of community shortly, but with this context in mind, I want to move to a quite different one, that of stem cell transplantation, which relies on ideas of tissue or histocompatibility. So at the close of World War II, European and American scientists were working on curing leukemia, and they were experimenting with transplanting tissue derived from bone marrow. This tissue would be removed from a healthy person, and it would be injected into somebody with leukemia, whose body might go on to reject the tissue. The concurrent mid-20th century discovery of HLA, or human leukocyte antigens, on our cell surfaces that could be either more or less compatible with another person's was a breakthrough in this regard. If you could find a donor with as similar a tissue type to the recipient as possible, the chances of rejection lessened. So immunologists often were working with population geneticists, and they made efforts to map HLA globally, which is how many publications with tables or heat maps of HLA frequencies start to appear, like this, like there's a particular HLA demographic in this African region or that Spanish autonomous community. So you get lots of kind of publications like this. And thanks to this sort of swell of immunological work, we're left with a relatively stable claim in the field of stem cell transplant that ethnic background is genetically consequential because of HLA distribution being heritable as a gene, and therefore you inheriting it from your parents means that if you come from one racial group, you're more likely to find a match from within that racial group. We see this in for example, in one of the US stem cell registries, patients are most likely to match someone who shares their ethnic background. And to make matches possible, bone marrow registries was built in the 1970s with the HLA data of willing volunteers. And these started popping up all over the global north. You might even be a member of one. Hands up, actually, are you a member of a bone marrow registry? Is anybody in this room one? No, just me. Okay, cool. But that gives you a sense, right? There's, I think in the world, probably about 40 million registered donors around the world. So a significant, but still relatively small number of people on Earth who sign up by providing a saliva swab from which their HLA type is discerned. So if a patient with the same HLA type is requiring one on the registry and searches the registry and finds you, you might then go on and donate your bone marrow. So in Europe alone, last year, about 20,000 different donations took place. So it's a relatively significant treatment option and also a very expensive one. Since we're in Hawaii, there's a picture of Jason Momoa at the bottom, who came to Hawaii this day last year to kind of help publicize an appeal for that chap on the bottom left there who couldn't find a match, a Pacific Islander boy, and he wanted to use his celebrity to encourage others to join the registry. Importantly, though, these registries are disproportionately white, or at least that's how they tend to be framed. So a prevalent problem claim around this disproportionality is that we do not have enough donors of non-white ethnicities on the global registries, and therefore these minority groups as patients have worse odds of white people of finding a match. And these claims are often coupled with visuals like the one up here. So 55% of Latinos cannot find a matching donor in the US, 75% of African Americans or 75% of multiracial people cannot find a match. If you were to look at these statistics for quote unquote white people, about 10% of white people wouldn't be able to find a match. So it's a huge difference there, statistically speaking, in the way that this discourse is elaborated. And this constitutes an example of a kind of a set of work basically that's being done to try and recruit people into different kinds of biomedical projects. So this claim informs a suite of actions designed basically to fix the problem. Let's recruit more donors of minority background by doing community-based work and increasing awareness of and engagement with donation beyond the white donor base. It constitutes an example of what Stephen Epstein described as an emergent recruitmentology, basically, that describes the practical and discursive work of engaging minorities around biomedical projects, as I say. So in my own work, I've been interested in attempts to recruit minoritized people onto the stem cell registries as an effort to generate what I've called an ethico-racial imperative, which relies on articulating a particularly racialized audience so that an appeal can then be made to that audience on ethical grounds. This might be in the form of doing recruitment work in a specific location, places of worship, cultural events where you might expect people of a particular community group to be. It might also be through the mobilization of perceived shared identity. So for many years, this recruitment work has been focused on trying to increase stem cell donor registrations in what we might think of as relatively discrete racial groups. So this is a picture of the founder of the African Caribbean Leukemia Trust, which operates in London. The founder set up a charity in the late 1990s with his partner to locate a match for their late son. And they now run events all over London to encourage and then sign up thousands of specifically African Caribbean stem cell donors every year. So the organization runs events at ostensibly Black places, so Black churches, Notting Hill Caribbean Carnival. And they speak in collective pronouns about the community's collective health struggle. So for such work, which describes is described as community recruitment, community appears to be the given. But as I've argued, community is in no small part the product of this racialized recruitment, the generation of affect and collectivity, rather than a fact, a resource simply to be tapped up by recruiters, if you like. So it's useful, I think, then to return in this context to this discourse that there's been an enormous increase of mixedness, cross-referencing this with the anxiety that mixedness is equivalent to a marginality or a lack of community here, and then drawing in another vector completely, which is the problematic framing of the mixed race body, genetically speaking. So in an interview with an immunologist, with an immunogenetics practitioner, I should say, who was involved with the UK stem cell registry, they describe how for them, the big problem is the mixed groups in trying to find matches. The most difficult patient cases we have are those of one common haplotype and their HLA profile, Caucasoid is the word she uses, with a very rare haplotype from an ethnic minority group. The mixed ethnicity who have that combination of haplotypes are the future of the country, she says, and in many parts of the world. So we have to promote people of mixed ethnic backgrounds to come forward. So at once, these people, us, we're increasingly common, but we're also problematic, not least because we are genetically rare. So mixed bodies also present a practical problem then when you lay on top of that this issue of mixed race people not having any kind of community. We think back to the idea of community recruitment. So whilst one can go to an historically Black church, mixed bodies, by the nature of transgressing racial bounds, understood to be significantly more distributed geographically. So as well as organizations, individual patients without a match also now run their own appeals. And very often these individuals have been told that their unusual HLA types, which are also told come from having a mixed ancestry, are the cause of a lacking match of donor. So they therefore seek other similarly racialized people who might then be their matching genetic donor. So consider the Facebook campaign for one Chinese, Thai, Italian 24-year-old woman who was trying to locate her own match. And she posts a highly shared illustration depicting her and her imagined donor connected by HLA illustrations that they've drawn here. And they mentioned the different kinds of subgroups that they're going to try and find her match in. That's where they've been told to try and find this person's match in the melting pot subgroups. So this said, let's have a look here. Sorry, I've missed my word here. Because I'm taking notes on the back of my stuff. I'm so sorry. Here we go. This said, the mixed race patient cast as the carrier of necessarily uncommon HLA types has this almost pathological rareness about them, which cannot be addressed by community work. So they have to rely on locating audiences with a particular apparent discrete racial background to feel confident they are reaching their intended audience. Social media then are enrolled and become a significant strategic tool of appeals as they seek out their community, if indeed mixed people engender one at all across the globe. So this network map of the same appeals Twitter activity depicts only tweets that went somewhere. This is a Twitter network map. And it mentions tweets that mentioned or replied somebody. Particularly, you'll note the users in the middle, the colored nodes. These are the people who did a lot of tweeting. But I want to focus on the black dots around the outside of the image. The appeal purposefully targeted mixed race celebrities. These are celebrities who did not reply, basically. These celebrity shout-outs arguably appeal to a sharedness of the genetically underwritten racial identity to try and foster a sense of kinship or duty. So, for example, Kim Kardashian, you have mixed race kids, so you need to help. All of this is done in an attempt to encourage the amplification of the appeal to celebrities' followers, who it is then perhaps hoped share similar ancestries to the celebrities themselves. Although whether that hypothesis bears out that you only follow people on social media who are the same ethnicity of you is one to consider. But in turn, they hope that that will then engage other people who follow these celebrities to then register as stem cell donors. So this is an example of the attempt to generate a kind of community that might compel action. But vitally, for this patient at least, multiracial and mixed race celebrities turn out to be completely ineffectual and actually do nothing to help find a match. So I've mapped out then the contemporary collision of an historically enduring discourse of the socially troubled, communityless, mixed race body, and a claim to a demographic swell. I've also tried to describe how that socially troubled body is, in effect, genetically troubled, a problem blend of common alleles that render them rare, thus casting a new kind of practical problem for the stem cell registry. And this takes place in a context where racial diversity has become a driving concern of recruitment to the stem cell registry. To achieve this, the undergirding logic then is often that people who can claim to be from within the same community as those they're appealing to are more likely to be the effective people to engage that community. So in tissue donation, the idea is that the mutual subject position of the asker and the asked will do something effective. One ought to do something for their community. And mixedness then presents a kind of a practical challenge, revealing the limits of recruitmentology as a practice that relies on fostering a sense of shared racialized identity. Mixed bodies defy the utility of the shorthand of race, such that an appeal to the mixed population is potentially a less valuable endeavor. Moreover, how does one appeal to a community that, as scholars have argued, perhaps doesn't exist at all in a way that appeals can even be made to it? So I shall leave that there. I've taken my cue. I've had my 15 minutes. I'm getting off the stage. Thank you so much. Yeah, of course. Who's next? Is it Tal or Eunice? Eunice. Oh, it's Tal. Eunice? Who's up? Eunice. Sorry. Just give me sit stand. Yeah, okay.
So we will save questions until after all of the presentations.
Is that one yours? Yeah.
Yes. Ooh. Great. So our next speaker is Sang-Yeon Eunice Lee from Indiana University in Bloomington, and will be presenting a paper called Standard Man of a Nuclear Family, Dosimetry, Racialized Irradiation, and the Human. And I will try to stop the thing before it. It's musical.
Hi, I'm Sang-Yeon Eunice Lee. I'm a guest on this INA, and I'm a Korean immigrant to the indigenous lands of Miamiaki, Lenape, Potawatomi, and Sagamore people, also known as Indiana. And thank you to Ross and Anne for including me in this amazing panel. And I do have to warn you, my work is more humanities focused, so it'll be a slight change in tenure, but you've been warned. Okay, so in the poem, The Leaf Book, the speaker tells her life as a third grader. Some of her experiences would be considered remarkably normal. She works on her school project with her parents and she's on the swim team. Some would be considered not so normal. To quote her, she's that one mixed kid who doesn't quite fit in, and she's often confused by her friends and the school in general. So for instance, when she's asked, how tall is the average man, as an oral test question to enter the quote unquote genius program, third grader I answers, and I'm quoting her, I answered with all I knew, my own height, 4 feet tall. Here I stay with this seemingly childish wrong answer in the poem and the poetry collection itself to question how embodied knowledge would offer an alternative to understanding the standardized and quote unquote objective knowledge in the aftermath of imperial violence. The poem is in the poetry collection titled A Nuclear Family by Japanese-American poet April Naokohek, in which she begins with Hiroshima in 1945 and ends in North America in 2011. Writing on this specific moment in her family's history, Heck reflects on the multiple ways the term nuclear comes to describe her family and exerts different forms of violence, from the atomic bomb to the structures of normative family formation. Considering this larger context, the narrative of the poem appears as semi-autobiographical, where the mixed-race child from Japan confronts the violence of standardization and normativity and the objectivity of knowledge that exists outside her body and her lived experiences, yet drawn from the experiences of people very much like her. The exact same question, how tall is the average man, would yield a very different answer for the International Commission on Radiation Protection, or ICRP, which is an international agency that collects data from radiation exposure cases and compiles them to produce standardized knowledge on how radiation affects the human body. While the report clarifies that it's not statistical average it is looking at, the quote-unquote standard man, as he was called in 1949, originally at the Chalk River Conference on Permissible Dose, which was held in Ontario, Canada, or the reference man, as he was called in subsequent meetings since the 1950s, is 170 centimeters tall. The report further specifies that he is, and I'm quoting here, between 20 to 30 years of age, weighing 70 kilograms, and he lives in a climate with an average temperature of 10 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius. He is Caucasian and is a Western European or North American in habitat and custom, end quote. Over the course of nearly 500 pages, ICRP further specifies him, giving him a datafied body and a theoretical everyday life that supposedly serves as the basis for understanding the effects of radiation damage and, to an extent, nuclear violence. I stay with these two very different answers to the same question: how tall is the standard man? I bring together ICRP's enunciation of the standard man with April Nalcohec's poems from A Nuclear Family to explore the incommensurability of establishing a normative, healthy body and life for radiation dosimetry based on the white, heteronormative standard man, when the data of violence comes from the people who are very different from the standard man. After all, the vast majority of those with firsthand experience of nuclear weapons detonations and subsequent radiation, as we know, differed significantly from the white heteronormative standard man. In so doing, I underscore the ways in which whiteness depends on racialized sufferings and normativity depends on the experiences of non-normative lives to define its boundaries against the alien, irradiated, and bombed other, like the Hibakusha populations from the bombs that the US dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and from nuclear weapons testing conducted on Pacific Islands for decades after the end of World War II. Furthermore, I draw a contrast between the datafied body that makes frictionless travel across empires to protect the white heteronormative construction of man and his female and later Japanese counterpart, and the survivors and their messy and transgressive movements with and against normativity as constructed by the empires that displaced them in the first place. So there are three main highlights in this talk. One, I share my view with many others like Teresia Teraiwa, Elizabeth Delory, Erin Suzuki, Miley Arvin, and Rebecca Hogue, and underscore how whiteness is constructed in the atomic age through racialized populations in the Pacific margins of the US empire. In this case, not merely through nuclear weapons detonations, but through radiation protection, and by establishing the boundary around the category of those who deserve protection. In a second and related note, I argue that the standard man and the accumulated data on radiation violence construct an imperial archive that is built from deaths and dead bodies, including the casualties of war and human experimentation. Third, I emphasize the ways in which April Nalcohec's poetry engages with the dual meanings of nuclearization to call attention to the imperial archive's devouring of individual lives and to challenge its desire to homogenize and standardize lives into categories of normativity. So to take a closer look at the standard man, here is the table that I drew directly from the ICRP publication. So as I mentioned earlier, ICRP specifies the standard man as 170 centimeters tall, between 20 to 30 years of age, weighing 70 kilograms, and he's set to live in a climate with an average temperature of 10 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius. He's also specified as Caucasian and is a Western European or North American in habitat and custom. While this already very specific limitation that obviously did not account for global warming, because who knows how long we're going to stay within the 10 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, right? This publication on the reference man specifies them even further from the overall quantity of blood, which is 5,200 milliliters, the weight of his liver, which is 1,800 grams, down to the thickness of the horny layer of his skin of his scrotum, which is 9 micrometers. Page after page and chapter after chapter, the publication reveals the standard man as a datafied body that is paradoxically produced and metaphorically reproduced through countless bodies that experienced sickness, suffering, and death, pieced together from medical inspections and measurements of severed organs and parts of autopsy bodies. Reducing body parts to standardized weight, volume, and composition, the report stitches together fragments of anonymous cadavers to galvanize it into a white man who eats, breathes, and follows a standardized pattern of modern labor. The standard man subsumes and devours countless bodies, both literally and figuratively carved and fragmented into parts. Numerous bodies as a part of the standard man do not remain in its entirety. Skins are split, blood is drained, and sinews are cut. Yet he is presented as a seamless being with a wholly functioning body, with a life of perceived normativity, and functions as the standard for permissible doses of radiation. As a standard dummy, he freely moves in and out of various places and situations, from a scientific research lab and a medical clinic to the epicenter of the atomic bomb, without the specific race and often gender-based vulnerabilities that place them in the epicenter in the first place. An assembled datafied object, he moves from one empire to another as data, contained and detached from the countless bodies with their own lives in which he was measured. Through the seamless travel of the datafied body, the magnitude of radiation damage also travels as data, detached from the racialized and gendered bodies that mined, transported, manufactured, and experienced the detonations of atomic weapons, the non-white, non-male, and non-European and non-North American peoples. If the datafied body and life of the standard man is made after the image of the North American and European physicists and political decision makers who created and detonated atomic bombs, what would we see when we highlight narratives of the racialized peoples who experienced the bombings and their fallout? To answer this question, I return to April Naoko Heck's work. The poetry collection, A Nuclear Family, follows people, as it centers on the complex literal and figurative fallout from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima through the intimate stories about her family. Over half a century and across continents, Heck interweaves the ways in which the nuclear bomb lives on through her, the granddaughter of a hibakusha, within the nuclear family and the larger political forces that nuclearized her family. Her emphasis on this expansive connection across generations and her dogged determination to follow the people and their memories and the full extent of their relations stand in stark opposition to the logic of fragmentation that the Imperial Archive uses to create the standard man and move datafied understandings of suffering from one place to another. In a collection of memories of trauma and survival, she makes relations from one place, she makes relations and builds bridges over dark spots of memory to accept transgressive acts that blur boundaries rather than severing organs to measure it as transportable data. Through Heck's poetry, I highlight this building of kinship relations and strengthening of family ties that reject standardization and nuclearization. I focus on the unclear, the muddy, and the transgressive acts and words that are enlivened by shared memories to examine the ways in which the clear-cut histories and standardized official narratives exist in service of itself. I particularly turn to literature and the regenerative potential of speculation, sharing aim with many brilliant others like Saidiya Hartman, Avery Gordon, and more specific to Trans-Pacific Haunting and Grief, Gina Kim's work. To do this, I'd like to take you to the poetry collection's title, A Nuclear Family. As a collection on a family torn and connected through the ties brought on by nuclear bombs, Heck's family history is a nuclear one. But as the clever title reminds us, it is also a musing on the heteronormative ordering of society through the basic unit, or the nuclear family. Sociological studies on the nuclear family began in the 20th century and exploded in the atomic age. Heck's use of the title highlights the nuclear family structure as an immediate aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as the bombings that brought her American GI father to Japan and created a rift between her grandmother and her mother because her mother married her father and having the mixed race, quote unquote, lopsided granddaughter that the poem talks about. In many ways, the bomb that her great-grandmother experienced led her to become a part of the nuclear family across the Pacific Ocean in the US as an isolated dot in Ohio. At the same time, the use of the title similarly highlights a social formation away from an extended understanding of family and gestures towards existing sociological research in the 20th century that saw the nuclear family as a necessary prerequisite for the attainment of the quote-unquote good life, and prevalent Asian American racialization in the last quarter of a century as the model minority. In examining the poetic exploration and racialized violence of atomic bombs and the ensuing acute, chronic, and generational violence, I examined the limits of irradiated body and life of the model minority in the ruins of nuclear weapons detonations, as well as its subversive potential of renewal against the normative and standardized constructions of the good life. So in the larger paper version this is drawing from, I continue here to talk about 3 poems, and I very much engage in literary criticism, but to sort of reach a wider audience. And in light of this conference, I like to reach beyond the humanities, and I wanted to leave you with last few lines of the poem itself, the Leaf Book, which is reproduced in its entirety here. So this is taken from the last part where the American GI father calls to school when the speaker, after answering 4 feet tall as a 3rd grader, fails the entrance to the Genius program exam. He says, "Your test is wrong. This is your regional spelling champ, honor roll student, first chair in band. He listed bell choir, softball, swim team, even states and countries I've seen. But I have to try harder. I know the wrong kinds of love. Scarlet oak, white oak, black oak, laurel and pin, memorized by size and color, lobe and vein." Like the 2 daughters of the tiger mom, Amy Chua, Dad's list of the young speaker's accomplishments present an obedient model minority student who seeks to excel at every measurable category, ranging from academics to music to athletics and even travel experiences. If the family history of nuclearization or the breaking and building of relations through the nuclear weapons that end up as a nuclear family in the US, if the history prepared the speaker on the path to attaining the storied good life, she doesn't seem to succeed. Even at a young age, and perhaps as the poet reflects on her childhood, she knew her belonging was precarious and that she had to try harder. And in writing this poem, however, and noting the specific family history that makes her and her kin both the basis for radiation violence and the nuclearized model minority in the US, Heck presents an alternative to the standardization and opens the potential to reevaluate the racialized ways in which protection is enacted on nuclear Pacific. Thank you.
So thank you so much. What an excellent kind of series of engagements with mixedness. I mean, we'll have a lot to talk about. So as I mentioned, if you arrived late, we'll be having questions at the end. And so we'll be going ahead and hearing from our 3rd speaker, who is representing a co-authored piece. So Tao Fan is here with us from Monash University and has a co-author for this paper, Scott Wark from University of Kent. And the paper title is much shorter and easier for me to read, Race by Proxy. Thanks, Tao.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to Anne and Ros for organizing this really wonderful eclectic mix of people. And I just want to start by saying that I'm a guest on this INA visiting for the purpose of the conference and currently living on the unceded lands, now known as Australia, in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And as Anne mentioned, the paper I'm presenting today is the latest iteration of an ongoing collaboration between Scott Wark, who's at the University of Kent, and myself. And together we've been trying to think through how race and racialization is constituted in AI and data-driven cultures. And in this paper, I'll be focusing on a universal, though perhaps understudied aspect of the datification process, the role of proxies. So in algorithmic culture, the problem of racism is the problem of proxies. Though racism still continues in many familiar forms, the tools and techniques that further these racist legacies and turn bodies into racialized subjects now operate through very different registers. This is in part an effect of what Frank Pascal calls the black boxing of platforms and their processes. A normalized culture of opacity in which large corporations shield their interests behind technical complexity, real secrecy, and trade secret laws. For some, this culture of opacity is an issue to be solved through better techniques of accountability and transparency. The aim is to render black boxes more explainable and observable, to make private interests and private algorithms more legible to public scrutiny. Yet, as many critical data scholars have argued, opacity isn't a straightforward condition that can be remediated through frameworks of shedding light or opening up, but is in many cases an inherent aspect of the complex and fragmentary nature of algorithmic infrastructures themselves. Sorry, just trying to find them. Of interest for us here is how AI and machine learning practices navigate this necessary, sorry. Just
Oh, there you
I've got to go
It's fine.
wild.
Okay.
My mouse.
To the left.
There he is. Thank you. Practices navigate this necessary opacity to act on data that represent race and racialized subjects, making them perceivable within rigid systems of computation and governance. And to do so, I'll be using the concept of the proxy. So in general terms, a proxy is a substitute or a surrogate, a representative or a stand-in. In data science and statistics, proxies have an even more specific meaning. They're features that can be used in place of a variable that cannot be measured. So take recommender systems. The aim of a recommender system is to present people with things they want, to predict or arguably to manufacture desired behavior. Amazon recommends products you might like to buy, Netflix recommends movies you might like to watch, and Twitter recommends people you might like to follow. But these systems cannot produce a complete understanding of your preferences or desires. Actually determining what people want is much more complicated than it seems, because people rarely have a coherent, rational, or even consistent sense of what they want. Desirable is variable and fluctuating, liable to be influenced by others and to change with context. It can contradict our professed values or be harmful to us, or can be mysterious or inexplicable. Sometimes we simply don't know what we want. Desire, as it turns out, is elusive and immeasurable. So in the face of the impossibility of knowing desire, recommender systems instead make a substitution based on other signals, usually behaviors that can be observed and measured in computational terms. So for most platforms, this takes the form of a wide range of explicit and implicit signals. These range from types of explicit engagement, things like clicks, views, shares, reactions, or what's called dwell time, through to other kinds of implicit feedback, such as inferences drawn from people in your network. In data science, this is called determining revealed preference, and is premised on the assumption that observable actions can be used to reconstruct the motivation and preferences of a person. This approach is informed by now outdated 19th and 20th century economic theories of consumer behavior, specifically the characterization of the consumer as a rational actor whose actions are driven by frameworks like informed decision-making and the utilitarian agenda. Determining revealed preference operates through a series of proxy substitutions. Clicks as proxy for engagement, engagement as proxy for rational behavior as proxy for desire, desire as proxy for identity and the self. And while desire might not be amenable to calculation and optimization, its proxies are. Proxies are thus the inevitable effect of tools that seek prediction despite unknowability, that manufacture order amidst chaos. They substitute what we want to measure with what we can measure, allowing us to act on data about the world as if it represented the world itself. And on one level, we could argue that all data are proxies. They are representations, often numerical values, that are taken as stand-ins for certain phenomena in the world. Making knowledge with data is then always already a process of making substitutions. But with AI and machine learning systems, the vast array of applications, the scale of tasks, the complexity of processes, and the increasing stakes of outcomes now assigned to data-driven systems has new implications for lives caught within these regimes. To understand the harms and risks of AI and other big data-driven systems, then, one must also engage with the opacities, complexities inherent to proxies. And one of the cruel ironies of the data-driven age is that systems designed to solve or reduce harms like racism and racial discrimination have in practice entrenched or expanded their effects. So a key example is proxy discrimination. So direct discrimination on the basis of gender, race, sexuality, or other protected attributes is usually protected by law. So for instance, the use of race is an explicit variable in the determination of decisions regarding credit eligibility, employment, or housing. But discrimination can also occur indirectly through the use of correlations between protected classes and other attributes. So for instance, the use of postcodes as a proxy for race, income as a proxy for gender, and this is known as proxy discrimination. Here, discrimination is a byproduct of AI models that draw associations, inferences, and other statistical relationships between correlated sets of data. So for example, a 2012 Wall Street Journal investigation found that the American retailer Staples adjusted online prices for users based on their proximity to competitor stores. The intention was that customers living within 20 miles of a rival store, such as Office Depot, would receive greater discounts and deals. What was overlooked, however, is that access to infrastructure like retail stores is highly correlated with geography and postal codes, which in turn are correlated with income and race. And the result was that low-income and racialized neighborhoods consistently received higher prices for Staples products. So here, race was not included as an explicit variable, but the patterns discovered by the AI and machine learning tools nevertheless produced racial discrimination as a second-order effect. So how do we address these pernicious forms of sexism or racism? On the one hand, we could argue, as many scholars have, that racist and sexist outcomes are not simply the unintended consequences of working with big data, but are the all too predictable result of systems designed to recognize existing patterns in social relationships. They reveal what Solon Barocas and Andrew Selps call the simple fact of inequality. On the other hand, we might take a broader look, acknowledging that these AI systems have themselves been introduced as a solution to the problem of good old-fashioned human racism that pervades institutional decision-making. With this in mind, we can examine the almost naive logic behind this approach. Winnicott describes this succinctly as the assumption that racism and discrimination naturally stems from human recognition, and thus the cure must be the erasure of all visible markers of difference. If only we get rid of the markers of race, it is presumed, then all would be good. This approach thus constitutes another kind of what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls a colorblind racism that overinvests in the neutralizing force of technology. But as the persistence of proxy discrimination shows, race-free does not necessarily equal racism-free. Problems like proxy discrimination have proven themselves to be incredibly vexed issues for computer scientists, policymakers, and critical scholars alike. Try as we might, we can't seem to stop proxy discrimination from happening, even when, or maybe I should say explicitly when, race is actively excluded as a feature or variable within a data set. Even if we look at efforts to remediate proxy discrimination through technical procedures of verification and audits, we find proxies everywhere we go. So, for example, in this widely cited paper on auditing black box models for indirect influence, computer scientist Philip Adler and his team developed a method to determine whether specific features in a data set, things like gender or race, influence the outcome of a model's prediction. And if so, to what degree? And their focus was specifically on proxy discrimination in black box models. And to do this, they used two techniques: synthetic data and models of models. And both these techniques can be interpreted as themselves relying on proxy logics. So synthetic data is an artificially manufactured data set. It's data that's been created rather than derived from actual real-world measurement, and is often used as a stand-in for tests to validate or train machine learning models. It looks and has the attributes of a real-world data set, but has the added bonus of being already cleaned, as well as sidestepping issues to do with data privacy. So for example, synthetic data is often used in healthcare contexts because it allows for the public use of record-level data without having to worry about patient confidentiality, because the features represented are not derived from real-world people, but proxy subjects. Similarly, models of models are used as a stand-in when one is precluded from accessing a model's backend. They're specifically used in cases of black boxes when a researcher is unable just to tweak and rerun an algorithm to see what effect chaining this or that variable will have. Instead, the approach is to create a model of a model. a kind of approximation of how you think the model works based on what is observable. What this example illustrates then is that even in our efforts to observe or measure proxies and their effects, we rely on techniques that are themselves premised on proxy logics. So when it comes to knowing and being with algorithms, then it really is proxies all the way down. So what does this mean for understanding contemporary instantiations of race? In the slippage between absence and presence, between measurement and representation, between the erasure of race and the persistence of racist effects, we find the kernel of what we want to call a logic. This logic helps us to explain not only how racism continues to manifest within systems designed to remedy against prejudice, but to understand precisely how race is being acted upon and transformed in this process. We want to call this logic proxification. Proxification operationalizes the as-if. It puts it to work in systems and structures that seek to render the world into computational terms, to make it more amenable to order and control. It transforms racial politics from a politics of identity and identification to a politics of proximity and approximation. Machine learning systems transform the logic by which subjects are sorted into groups. Such systems don't discern our identity per se. Rather, they draw inferences and approximations, creating clusters that group people together, not on resemblance, common characteristics, or meeting specific criteria, but instead on a spatialized proximity or distance. Louisa Moore responds to the work of scholars such as Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr, for whom classificatory systems are traditionally understood as exhibiting consistent principles and mutually exclusive categories, such that a rose is a rose, not a rose sometimes, and a daisy at other times, arguing that with the rise of contemporary clustering techniques, the classificatory system segments the world in ways that allows for more flexible principles and mutable categories, so that perhaps a rose could belong to the daisy cluster under certain circumstances. This is why we're often given percentage confidence rates on tasks that require object recognition. So for instance, a machine vision system that classifies this as 95% a table, you as 23% a criminal. The populations calculated and constructed by AI and ML systems are premised not on discrete shared characteristics, on identity, but on measures of alignment that constitute difference in terms of distance. Difference in terms of distance. Distance between flat loci in vector space. Proxies stand in for the immeasurable. In this case, it's the immeasurable force of racism that endures, even as we make efforts to create model worlds that are otherwise. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So lots of resonant ideas to think about as we have our final paper of the day by Tracy Teslow, who's joining us from the University of Cincinnati and presenting a paper on scientific expertise, racial inequality, and adoption in the United States.
Actually, I changed my title slightly because I needed to focus because I have 15 minutes.
Excellent.
There's that annoying bar for you.
Okay. All right. So so I'm going to focus on this idea of passing for white in American adoption in the mid-20th century. So, and I want to say thanks as well to Rosie and Anne for including me in this great panel. So Paul Gilroy has argued that understanding race's relationship to economics, politics, and power in the pursuit of a world free of racial hierarchies with the aim of achieving more substantive democracy and authentic justice requires us to reconstruct the history of race in modernity, offering multiple genealogies of racial discourse that can explain how the brutal dualistic opposition between Black and white became entrenched and has retained its grip on the world in which racial and ethnic identities have been anything but stable or fixed. So I have a small contribution to that large problem. I'm going to offer a brief example of just such a genealogy of racial discourse by looking at the intersection of science with adoption practice in the mid-20th century US. At that time, adoption professionals turned to scientific expertise in their efforts to place children in new families. Both children and prospective adopters were assessed by a coterie of specialists, including not only social workers, but also experts in medicine, psychology, anthropology, and genetics. Employing a framework of what they called matching, agencies assessed how well a child would fit with prospective adoptive parents on a range of characteristics that were viewed as essential to proper child development and the creation of a healthy family. One of the most critical variables was race. From early practices that assumed parent and child should share the same race, to the 1960s when interracial adoption by white parents was promoted by leading adoption agencies as a solution to the problem of, quote, hard to place non-white children, to the 1970s when the National Association of Black Social Workers denounced placement of Black children with white families. Given the short time that I have today, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of science and race in mid-century American adoption, the nexus of passing for white with genetic constructions of race as a strategy to allay adopters and adoption professionals' anxieties about safeguarding whiteness, a practice which framed Blackness as a genetic liability to be avoided in white family formation. By the 1950s, adoption agencies started moving away from an almost exclusive focus on placing white, blue ribbon, and they used that term, blue ribbon infants, conceptualized retrospectively as risk-free adoption, less risky than the usual natural form of family formation, and toward soliciting and encouraging potential adopters who could meet the needs of children deemed less than perfect, or as they called them, hard to place. Got it. Okay. Okay. Sorry, find where I am. This 1954 article in the Saturday Evening Post titled "Babies for the Brave" by Alice Lake captured the growing critique of what had previously been an unquestioned standard of practice among public and private agencies. Here we go. Barely a half dozen years ago, she wrote, a baby eligible for adoption through a reputable agency carried a gilt-edged guarantee, much like that of a purebred Holstein calf. A cloudless heredity and a little body unblemished by defect were assured as a matter of course. Less risk than in natural parenthood was the keynote of the transaction. Yet the author also noted that 90% of adopters still wanted a, quote, normal, healthy infant of good stock. Black babies remained the single largest hard-to-place group, she said. The corollary to the blue ribbon adoptee was the, quote, unadoptable child. This category included children over 5, those with physical or emotional disabilities, as well as those with a racial disability, where a non-white or racially mixed ancestry was framed as a liability. Caseworkers frequently reported in professional journals that white adopters were reluctant to take children of color, especially children with Black backgrounds. When agencies began a more concerted effort to find homes for these hard-to-place non-white and mixed-race children in the 1950s, there were a series of modestly successful, often short-lived efforts to find families of color. More commonly, agencies looked to their usual pool of white adopters to find couples who could tolerate or accept children of mixed racial parentage. Many of those white adopters would consider it only if the child appeared white. This was still a period when most adoption professionals and the general public assumed that adoptive parents and their adopted child should share the same racial identity, a form of white boundary maintenance that was framed as necessary for proper family formation and child development. Caseworkers argued that parents would better accept a child who looked like them, that racial matching would produce a family whose formation through adoption would not be visible and thus could seamlessly blend into their existing family and community, and where a child could develop without the trauma of difference. In this context, agencies and prospective parents sought scientific expertise to understand and manage adoptions deemed especially risky, hoping to avoid unwanted outcomes, including failed or traumatic placements. The racial politics of whiteness converged in agencies and potential adopters. Agencies, staffed almost entirely by white female social workers, were eager to find permanent homes for children who had long been left aside, while many white potential adopters were reluctant to venture very far from the ideal adoptee, or so the agencies assumed. In the midst of post-war 20th century scientism, engaged in a practice tarnished by black market baby scandals, And amid popular resentment towards social workers as obstructionist busybodies, adoption professionals were eager to ground their work in supposedly objective bodies of knowledge. One of the leading geneticists who advised adoption agencies was Sheldon Reed, a geneticist who trained under William Castle at Harvard in the early 1930s, and in 1947 became director of the Dite Institute of Human Genetics at the University of Minnesota. He's most widely known for inventing the phrase genetic counseling, in part to separate the genetic advice he and his peers began offering in post-war America from the eugenics of an earlier period. Genetic counseling seemed a natural fit to adoption agencies. Human geneticists used their expertise to more precisely calibrate risk of conception for those conceiving children and of development for those adopting. Genetic counseling was thought to remove the old specter of bad blood through expert assessment of genetic risk. Genetic counseling offered the hope of discovering what was lurking in the genome and whether it would reveal itself to the world, either at birth or more perilously later on from the point of view of the agencies and the adopters. Would a child turn out to be Black? Would she one day give birth to a Black child? In this world of racialized anxieties, whiteness became a genetic trait to be quantified, monitored, husbanded, and reproduced within families through natural reproduction or via adoption and adoptive family formation. The kind of genetic counseling that Reed developed can be understood as a brand of updated post-war eugenics. Reed didn't subscribe to a program of eliminating so-called defective genes and their carriers from society, as had earlier eugenicists like Charles Davenport or Harry Laughlin. Reed was much less apt to describe an individual's fate as fixed by their genetic heritage, and much more inclined to see questions of heredity as individual or familial risk assessment. He developed the practice of what he termed genetic counseling to estimate the likelihood of and to navigate past unwanted outcomes. But when it came to whiteness, that was a genetic boundary he was prepared to defend. In 1962, Reed and his graduate student Esther Nordley published the results of a follow-up study of children from racially mixed backgrounds, or as they termed it, children of questionable racial admixture, who had been brought for evaluation to the Dite Institute by adoption and child welfare agencies. Reed noted in his Handbook for Practitioners, Counseling in Human Genetics, that the greatest number of requests for information and counseling at the Institute came from clients concerned about race, especially concerns about the heredity of skin color. In 1957, he claimed he saw babies practically every week to determine whether there is an appreciable amount of Negro blood. In their article, Reed and Nordley discussed genetic adoption counseling as a matter of detecting Blackness where it was not readily apparent. Sometimes, they wrote, the dilution with white is so great that the admixture is not readily apparent. The main difficulty is that the traits may not be apparent in an infant. An infant who is only 1/4 or half Negro may look white. Genetic counselors like Reed relied on a variety of physical cues to evaluate babies and children, especially areas of dark pigmentation on the body, epicanthal eye folds, or curly or kinky hair. The authors divided the children in their study into 5 racial groups based on their earlier recommended family placement. I'll go through these briefly. Oh, there's Reed in his article. Sorry, forgot about that. There he is. All right. So placement by race. And this is where they created this ideal of matching. And here on the right, I have a table from their article, the alleged ancestry of these 49 children that they're dealing with here. So the first category is white. Children assessed to have no non-white ancestry who were recommended for white homes. And these are children who the agencies were concerned did have some non-white ancestry. So that was 8 of 49. White with admixture, white with signs of racial admixture, but as they said, wrote so little it would come within the normal variation of the Caucasian race and was thought not likely to change to look appreciably less Caucasian. They concluded these children could pass for white and could be placed with white families. That was about 1/3 of the children, 17. Borderline white. These 10% were swarthy children with dark eyes and or dark hair, a subgroup of those who could pass for white. This critical group were recommended for families of Mediterranean descent. If those of you who were with us earlier, that's the bottom level of Caucasian in the 19th century. Fourth, children deemed Black or non-white. These were children deemed, quote, too dark or too Negroid looking to pass for white. These children were recommended for Black families because they were too Black to expect to adjust well in a white community. And I might mention these are kids in Minnesota. I can talk about that more later. And then the last category, Mongolian, their term. In addition to Japanese, this included children who appeared to be Mexican or Native American, in a category more commonly understood as Asian. These children were also recommended for white homes. Agencies came to Reed's Institute seeking a racial evaluation so they could determine under the racial matching philosophy what type of placement would be, quote, satisfactory. Reed offered no unequivocal answers as to whether a mixed race child would be able to pass for white as an adult. In his handbook, he said there had not been enough research on the heredity of racial differences to be confident about the scientific validity of their predictions. But he wrote, we must do the best we can with what we have. Problems affecting people today have to be solved today. Just in conclusion, I think one of the things this shows us is the way that geneticists, and I don't have time to talk about anthropologists, but others are struggling in this period with race because they seem to understand it as simultaneously what they view as a valid descriptive category and as an unstable, what I would call biosocial abstraction. They use racial categories even while noting the ways they didn't work. They struggled with the failure of race as an analytic biological category, while also aware of the social meanings of race and ethnicity, if not always of their own assumptions. Geneticists and adoption professionals relied on what they in the article called best guesses to place children and hoped to follow-up studies like Reed and Nordley's would demonstrate if they'd been right. In 1962, Reed and Nordley admitted in their article that they had been wrong in 27% of the cases. Children did not always turn out as expected based on a later assessment by caseworkers. Moreover, it's clear from the way Reed and others who consulted for adoption professionals talked with them about the nature of race and the categories they used, that they were perfectly aware that race, to come back to Paul Gilroy, was not a stable, fixed thing. Reed, for example, noted that despite the diagnostic importance that he placed on hair texture, so-called kinky hair appeared in people who had no African ancestry, or at least to their knowledge. Reed and Nordley noted that some of the children didn't fit into any of their categories, and their nearly 1/3 failure rate was chalked up to problems in semantics and subjectivity. I think Paul Gilroy would agree with them. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you so much. It's just such an excellent range of papers that I think really spoke to one another really well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we can see folks online and welcome any questions that we may have from there as well as from the room. Oh, welcome, Nadine. Nice to see you at the odd hours of the day. Yeah, so of course I have, actually, since we're all here in person, do you guys want to come up? We can put questions to you together. Does anyone have a question to kick off? I certainly can.
I could. Is that okay?
Go for it.
Yeah, I guess Tracy, I'm still brewing on yours. That was amazing. No, not at all. Oh, thank you. I guess the question then, and it may relate to Tracy, but it's the first one I guess is to Pal, is this idea of races and measurability. Sorry, yeah. So Pal, in your presentation talked about the idea of proxy as the device for measuring the immeasurable. So in the context of an algorithm in the US or even in the UK, it's not permissible. You're not allowed to collect that data in a way that you just have a lot of. So is race in that sense immeasurable because it's illegal, or is it immeasurable because it's impossible to measure?
It's probably what's interesting is probably I was talking about proxy in the sense of the measurement, but it's also a workaround to get over the legality of measurement. So very famously, Facebook got in trouble for being well, most of us we recognize as racial profiling, as racial targeting for purposes of advertising. But they just got away with it because they weren't calling it racial profiling, they were calling it targeting. And categorizing people according to ethnic affinity categories, which were explicitly racial categories, things like African American versus Hispanic Asian, those were explicit ethnic affinity categories. And what was controversial about it was that you could target ads based at those groups, or you could exclude ads. And so you could say, do not show this ad for Alabama scholarship or what have you, two groups who are African American versus Asian. And they were arguing this poses to the elder person as advertising, important to like our messages should go to the should be targeted and so on. But what was really interesting is that Facebook doesn't categorize people according to race. Facebook doesn't ask people to self-identify according to race. They infer your ethnic community based on your behavioral data. And so it was a case of it's illegal to do that. Yet with the desire to do that, manufacturing sort of use other proxies by which to achieve that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it really speaks to this question of identity and alignment that I felt like was a theme through all of your work, right? So this kind of fraught, imperfect, but not quite separable distinction between identity and alignment, right? So it seems like between, obviously that comes up in Rose's paper, thinking about the challenges of reaching out to a community that has no community. So with whom are they going to align? How are they going to kind of achieve that possibility that can only be realized, right, through the community work of a community that is hard to identify or to align with. And then in Eunice's paper, which is so beautiful, we should have a lot more poetry at 4S. But this is also a real problem, right? It sounds like for this poet who is kind of navigating a mixed race identity, dropped into Ohio with a very fraught history. And then, of course, Kao has already spoken a little bit more about this issue of identity inferred from alignment in a way. And of course, it's very much at stake in your paper in thinking about family. And I wonder, if maybe you all have comments about how these problems of identity and alignment get refracted for you through the others, or if you have more reflections on that. That's a question for anybody, I suppose.
Well, in the history of adoption, it's still really broad. Because I only mentioned very briefly, by way of introduction, the National Association of Black Social Workers vehemently opposed interracial adoption and insisted on same-race adoption for a whole variety of reasons. All of the one of the things I think is interesting is that all of the actors talk about the best interest of the child. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing for the child. And yet they come at it from very different directions and come to very different conclusions about what that is. And I think from the point of view of the Black social workers in the 1970s, it's a different social context, civil rights, and kind of a perspective that takes into account what's happening in the United States and where they think a Black child is going to be safe. Who should rear the child to succeed in a racist world, and it should be Black parents doing it for Black children, that they didn't trust white parents to be capable of doing it. And I think there's some evidence to suggest there's evidence on both sides of the problem. But when you look back at Reed from a geneticist point of view, you can see him struggling with, when he's asked by adoption agencies, he does still think about racism as an essential identity. And so he does, I think, and agency professionals he's dealing with think of identity in very racialized terms, and so they understand family formation through that. They also do things like they're concerned about sort of intellectual matching and other things of matching too. It's not just racial, but yeah. So I mean, that doesn't really, that's just me sort of rambling. It's not really the answer, but I feel like it's identity itself is a contested
kind of definition, especially if you look at it across time. But the other piece of it is, you know, when I'm talking about creed, the people consulting him are not ranging very widely in thinking about what a family looks like or who could be a good parent. It's also class-based, so not only race-based, but class-based, sex-based. We have a very narrow definition, which comes back to the family, a very narrow definition of that, about what a good family looks like. That excludes people. And that doesn't account for identity in terms of, say, like extended kin relations where a child can be raised by not more than just the mother and father.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely the center of Asian American racialization, specifically in the post-war era. Because one of the things that this project is really trying to do is to think the multiple levels of nuclearization, whether it was to move the after-Nazi nuclear weapons, but also the nuclear family formation that also went hand in hand with Asian American sort of inclusion into the U.S. context, thinking about it as a model minority of aligning with whiteness, right, as a way to sort of pass as the sort of like pseudo-white category that is very much established on the basis of anti-blackness, right? So I think it is definitely a question of, and that poem also really deals with that in a really immediate way of a third grader who is answering in the way that she thinks she knows, but also knowing that her white GI father is upset that his daughter is not turning out to be the model minority that she's promised to be as a half Japanese, half white girl who's living in that, right? So you sort of see that kind of personal desires and different sort of the plasticity of Asian American racialization in the US, especially in the post-war era, and how that alignment also goes hand in hand with sort of like desires for assimilation and that kind of the desire to explain whiteness when the racial categorization is definitely sort of classified them as other. So you see that kind of desire that seeps out of it. So I actually have a question. I was also like, from my context, something that I find really interesting is this question of white saviorism in terms of interracial and international options, specifically in the post-Korean War moment, in the post-Korean War moment, where at the end of the Korean War, which was 1953, they established a lot of Christianity-based adoption agencies that sort of transported in the beginning, like American GI soldiers' children, and they sort of quote unquote marketed them, right, as like, we need to save our grandchildren because Korea is really racist and they're not going to take good care of these half black and half white like babies, right? So I was wondering if your research into post-war genetic research, if there are any discussions around that, or if there are any sort of ways that white saviorism was quantified, right, as sort of like, we are actually doing good for these babies by placing them into white families, because a lot of these post-Korean War children and later on post-Vietnam War children were placed into white families.
Almost exclusively, yeah. Yeah, well, you know, like normally in Reed, when they talk about placing children with white families, they justify it. I think the racial piece is assumed, right? They don't really discuss the racial virtue of it, but they talk about the white families as families with greater resources, sort of material and social resources. And so I think that's so I haven't seen geneticists trying to sort of quantify it in genetic terms. But you're absolutely right that there was that impetus, and it happened after the Second World War to a certain degree too, out of Germany. But yeah, and it is, and you're right, it's also galvanized through these kind of Christian groups that see it as a saving children from terrible fate.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen, I mean, I'm not to say it doesn't exist, but I haven't yet seen the geneticists talking about the genetic genetics. Yeah, but I think the other piece of this is the way that organizations work. So the adoption agencies are working with these Christian groups, these sort of parent groups, these rescue refugee groups. And then they assume their pool of adopters are white, and they assume that those are the best homes. And in the case of the Korean kids, not all of the GIs, but many of them are white. And so then the logic is the best place for those children is white homes. And so in those cases, they're not necessarily bringing in the scientists because they already have a system in place and an assumption about where the good homes would be for those kids. And I think the other thing you see in the literature is that they talk about it as a kind of humanitarian effort where they'll figure out later whether it really works. You know, so they don't think in advance about what are the cultural requirements for taking, say, a Korean child and bringing them to the United States and raising that child in a way that will be good, best for that child based on Korean heritage or what they might have left behind. They just kind of, it's a kind of assimilation.
Yeah, Miss Ria and then Barka. And then
I really enjoy, especially like emotional friendship, really in terms of biological values. Like my taking it revolves around radiative kinship. How knowledge to produce these stories. So I might be wondering, I don't think read the entire poetry collection of that. And I particularly wanted to feel it from, and I agree with Anna, like we need so much more poetry in SES. And you have criticism is number one, that brings back to, you know, analysis of science and stuff. One question is there particular forums where like some kind of gets away from biological kinship, community kinship with other irradiated bodies, and kind of figure out and they got the mode of standardization where, you know, slowly both in terms of model minority and also in terms of, you know, when you get standardized person. And the other question is to do with, you know, protection with standards, right? And why those mysteries always shown as this one device that warrants protection. And specifically, I problematize the radiation protection framework. I'm also interested in how protection, through kinships or protection beyond standards would look like from the space that you're having, which is more literature, which takes me back like 7-8 years. And I started working on nuclear energy. So yeah, we should definitely talk more though. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm really conscious we've got people online. So that was a question about the poet that Eunice was talking about, whether she talks about biological kinship or other kinds of kinship, and then another question about standardization. Hopefully you'll pick up more detail in the answer.
Thank you so much. I would not have done that good of a job recounting the question. Well, thank you so much for that question. So first of all, like one of the poems that I really focus on in terms of the entire collection, it is very much like the very first poem that the collection opens up with is actually happening the day before the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. And that was like the moment where her grandmother goes into Hiroshima the day before, because the emperor wanted people to bring supplies, right? Like individual people to bring supplies into the study center. That's why her grandmother made the trek into Hiroshima, and that's when she was irradiated, right? So this entire collection is very much playing with this idea around different kinds of kinship, and it's not just that kind of the poet herself as a descendant of a Hibakusha, but also that kind of more than human kinship that happens after irradiation, right? And then the sort of irradiated backgrounds, but also a lot of that kind of kinship relations that she builds. And that's very much that kind of irradiated kinship that she builds even when she relocates to the US, because her father works at a nuclear power plant. So you sort of see these layers of different kind of connections of sort of like nuclear Pacific, right? That is going from Hiroshima and Nagasaki into different moments that the US empire and military sort of deploys people, and the Japanese empire as well deploys people into different Pacific spaces. She doesn't specifically talk about the US's nuclear testing in the Pacific, which is one of the moments that I really highlight as that sort of absent presence, right? And that's a lot of what my work is trying to do in the book as well. So to give us sort of a shorter answer to that question of kinship, but yes, absolutely. Like she's really interested in drawing different kind of connections, and she uses poetry itself as a way to deal with that, right? Like to deal with how do we draw kinship relations? And in particular, she's very interested in transgression. So in one of the poems, it's called How We Survived the War. And it's a really long run-on sentence of like, we did this, we did that, like we used our hands, we used one hand, and the entire poem is a poem of transgression where they say we as this almost a singular character, right? But the we doesn't necessarily have this uniquely divided body, and instead it has multiple body parts, it does multiple actions, they sleep with enemies, for instance, and it actively talks about this boundary crossing as survival, right? As acts of survival. So that's one of the reasons why I find this poetry collection to be really informative in thinking about Cold War scientific knowledge production in terms of like radiation dosimetry, but also thinking about, again, like the social sciences aspect of like neatly divided nuclear heteronormative families, right? And how that is the only way we can think about like different members of the society and imagine society as a whole, right? And in turn, what I'm trying to do here is to sort of grapple with the US empire from the margins, right? From this irradiated margins or the sort of like this transgressive margins that Ross also talked about, that kind of like mixed raceness itself as a sort of a marginal identity that doesn't necessarily have its own community, and you sort of see that, and it's that forging of community that she really tries to achieve through the poem. And I think the second question is really hard to be honest with you. This question of protection beyond standardization. I think one of the things that I really try to highlight in this is that a lot of these sort of datafied bodies within radiation protection is imagining different bodies, right? From the one that is irradiated, from the one that deserves protection. And that distance is something that I really want to highlight, right? That people who are actually irradiated are irradiated because of their race and because of their gender and because of their geographic proximity to the marginal spaces of the empire, right? And instead the protection is deserved or is directed towards those in the very center of it, the center of the empire, right? So by doing that, I'm highlighting how this protection itself is creating this sort of center periphery binary, right? And overcoming that center periphery binary would be one of the important steps. And something that I don't necessarily talk about in this talk is that they actually develop the standardized woman and the standardized Japanese person, for instance. So it very much goes into this sort of like collection of different identities as an expansion of protection, as opposed to reevaluating the standardization itself as a problematic sort of categorization, right? So I think taking that into account would be another way to think about how do we think about protection. And I think community-based activism would be a really great way to start that. Thank you.
Great. Barka and then Ashwin, and then I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So my question is for Tracy, and I was thinking about Reed at the time, if there was sort of overlap or conversation between genetic scientists like Reed and people and scientists in South Africa, in, establishing the apartheid state around that time. And because particularly the example of the curly hair for me was very imminent, because my mother-in-law is a mixed colored South African woman, and one of the tests she had to go through as a child was literally sticking a pen in the hair to see if it was an X. And at the same time, so my question is firstly that, and the second question was also about family planning, that you mentioned there's this idea of who should rear a child in a racist world. And I was thinking, according to family planning initiatives in the apartheid state, it's more like who deserves to get to raise a child. And it's very much determined by race, obviously, but also underneath that, the proxy is class. And so I was wondering if there's also sort of that kind of attitude.
Yes, yeah. So the first question about South Africa, Reed in particular, I don't think had any particular connections. And honestly, I mean, like any science, the geneticists are working internationally, but also there are local connections. And in terms of the genetic counseling, I think Reed was mostly in conversation with other practitioners in the United States doing that. So I don't think I have much to offer you about the South African context. Sorry. The second piece, yes, I mean there definitely is a a kind of logic about who deserves children, who's the best kind of recipient of an adopted child. It's complicated by these sort of two classes of children, the sort of the quote unquote blue ribbon baby, and then what they started out calling the unadoptable children. And the other thing is, they're very self-conscious about wanting to collect data. There's this kind of scientizing, social science, professionalizing that goes on in mid-century adoption professionals. And so they're trying to collect data and do outcome studies and try to figure out what works, what doesn't work. But they are very self-conscious about thinking about which kinds of parenting and families are going to be most successful with children. With the unadoptable, quote unquote, unadoptable children, they some of the studies show that agencies tended to sort of relax their criteria, but in a way that they viewed it as a kind of second best parent, right? Later critics would say that like say the Black social workers, that a lot of the criteria that they use to collect the best adopters also happen to exclude families of color, poorer families, who they repeatedly show don't do any worse job raising children when they try to look at it. Over and over again, they do these studies where 75% of the kids turn out fine no matter who they get placed with, which you think eventually would cause them to wonder about their criteria. Eventually it does. I mean, eventually they start relaxing, it starts to change in the late 60s and 70s. But yeah, so there's definitely this combination of class and race that are informing their ideas about who. There's also a whole other piece that I didn't talk about, or don't have time to talk about, but where they use psychiatry and psychology to also evaluate adopters, partially around their acceptance of infertility and their attitudes around infertility, because the other criteria for a long time that was required of adoptive parents was that they be infertile. They had to have medical certificates or doctors confirming that they were not capable of giving birth on their own in order to be eligible. So their whole, and that was partially a psychological evaluation as well.
And there's a lot. I mean, I'm sure that you discussed this in the broader work too. There's a lot that can be said about the reproductive justice of the women giving birth to these babies in the first place, right? I mean, this is implicit in yours, right?
Persists to the present day, right? It's a class distinction between those who adopt and those who are giving up children, either coercively or voluntarily.
But like this argument that, okay, the adoptive parents are better resourced. Well, you could give resources to other people.
Right. And when you get to the 70s, you get some people arguing for subsidized adoption so that families would be, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Ashwin.
Thank you all. My question is directed primarily to Jonas and Ross, but I think all of you have been spoken to. It's completely self-interested because I'm thinking about transgression. And I think both Ross and Jonas both, you've been talking about transgression just now, Ross, you brought transgression, I think, the beginning of your talk. I'd like to know how you think with that job. Because there are different senses that came up. You talk about it as survival. I think we talk about it as resistance, perhaps as freedom, as a social fact that needs to be guarded against the standardized man. In my work, we look at it as play. Are there different what senses of transgression you see that might be useful for us to think? But when you put that, the second part of this for me is feel like there's a movement between thinking of racialized subjects, which is present in all here, but we're thinking about participation, full participation in racialized environments. And then once you talk about community, unison, maybe you were talking about survival and resistance, ways in which people move from just being a subject of a racist structure to perhaps through transgression becoming participants. I'm offering that as something to think with, and it's like, what you take from that.
Thanks, Ashwin. Transgression to me is quite an interesting word. It does evoke depending upon if the sentence you're using it in, it could be a lot of fun, or it could be the worst thing you could do, right? In the context that I look at, who are people who are dying because they can't access a stem cell treatment. which actually came out of the Manhattan Project, which is very interesting that I'd like to talk to you about. Their racial identity, particularly when they have very rare alleles, which often maps onto them identifying as multiracial and mixed. It's always been their racial identity, at least in some valence or another, a positive thing. If we talked about it in binaries, you know, they're the tropical one at school. Everyone's interested in them. They have an exoticism about them that people find curious, and they perhaps can use that curiosity to their advantage. They're found aesthetically more attractive in school. All of these sorts of strange stories that get spoken about when I'm interviewing people. And then they talk about how that same racial transgression, which might be in some contexts more playful, although there are kind of histories of pain attached to it as well from when they've been bullied, is what's going to kill them. That's how they causally link their heritage to the fact that they cannot find stem cell. And so the idea of transgression in one sense is that it has a kind of a double edge to it, where it's the positive, but also the awfully fatal. Yet in that broader context, what I think is quite interesting in the space of biomedicine is how the idea of a mixed race subject, in trying to measure them, as Tracy was pointing out, with all these weird terminology and every kind of datum they can get their hands on, and it still falters. You cannot measure bodies in this way. And if anything, to me, the idea of mixed race subjectivity starts to crack the idea of race. And so it offers a transgression that speaks to the fallibility of a category that cannot legally, but also literally be measured. And so there's a kind of an exciting moment in that. And I'm conscious of how I speak from a place of privilege here, because my mixedness has always been seen as an advantage by everybody around me. And I've never had any harm from it. I don't really experience racism. I sometimes pass as white. I pass as all sorts of things, very often not what I see myself to be. So I speak from a place of privilege. But I do think that it offers a moment to reflect on the utility of race at all in any of these kinds of endeavours, given how impossible it is to measure. So that's just a couple of thoughts on that. Pass over this.
I think it's my birthday. I love talking about transmission. So I think to begin with, I really like this term transgression, and I use it quite a lot, especially in this chapter. So this is drawing from my larger book monograph that I'm working on. And the reason why I gravitate towards this question of transgression is because, first of all, the word itself talks a lot about boundary crossing, the act of crossing, right? And that's sort of like the most immediate way that I think about transgression, right? Again, that kind of neat categorization and standardization and the ways in which that people's lives cannot be contained in these neat boundaries, right? So it is transgressive in that sense that the impulse to create normative subjects within each category is supported by the existence of non-normative subjects or the transgressive subjects, right? So without transgressions, you won't have the boundary to cross, right? So that kind of construction is very interesting to me. And this might be my personal background as a scholar, but transgression is also a question of sin, right? So in a religious sense, when we talk about transgressions, when we talk about salvation, for instance, it is very much a question of the sinful body, right? And in that sense, I'm sharing a lot of these discussions with other scholars who are dealing with race and how race invokes these questions of sinfulness, right? How mixed raceness invokes sinfulness of committing sexual acts that is not supposed to happen, for instance, right? Like the questions of miscegenation would be a prime example of this, but also thinking about sinfulness as dirtiness, for instance, right? Or pollution, or the idea around the unsavory, the underbelly, right? And the existence of dirty, once again, is what supports the existence and acceptance of sterile and cleanliness, right? And how the racial and the race and racialized spaces are perceived as dirty spaces, right? For instance, especially with colonial and imperial religious rhetoric around non-imperial centers, right? So that's another sort of the larger geography that I'm trying to access in terms of what we count as clean and what we count as dirty. What do we accept as normative? What do we not accept as normative? Because in the larger part of this, I'm thinking a lot about digestion, especially sort of having a body that is ingesting and digesting transgressive things, right? Especially like radiation is a good example, and that's why this chapter is coming from that. but I also look at things like meatpacking byproducts, which is like turkey tail. We all eat turkey, but when we eat it, we don't eat the turkey tail organ attached to it. It's fatty organ where all the turkey tail feathers are attached to, and it's considered as dirty and non-human and non-normative. So in the US context, it's consumed by consumed as like pet food, like you give it to dogs, right? But it's heavily pushed for in the Pacific as like this delicacy that you're going to push to American Samoa, for instance, right? Or something like spam is also heavily pushed to these sort of like imperial peripheries, right? So these kind of transgressions, right, like the transgressions of what we think about as like the good, the pure, the religiously, the sanctimonious, right? Like, and what lies on the other side that supports this bifurcated creation of the dirty and clean and good and bad. Yeah, normative and non-normative.
So we had another question here.
Yeah, thanks to all the panelists. This is brilliant. I was struggling to figure out how to replace this question, and then was leaving the gift by saying, you know, mixed race subjectivity cracks open the category of race in some ways. And thinking about all the papers against one another, I want to ask this question from the perspective of substitutability. So what I think Sam was showing that, you know, these experiments that have been done on marginalized populations transpose rather seamlessly by standardized language, as metaphors of devouring, of travel, and so on. So you have this ability of substitutability. So I studied Nazis, and there's a lot of medical experiments done on prisoners, Jewish people, and so on, that are then one-to-one transposed onto quote-unquote Aryan journalists. Right? And so there's this presumption, although we should be naturalized, that it can be transposed. But the other two cases about mixed race have shown that there is there's an inability to substitute. You can't exist in their cause. You place the child and you do it right, and you don't do it right. So these mixed race children come to be unsubstitutable. And in lots of skills as well, you need the particularity of any need particular violence. And so I'm kind of wondering where this leaves us. I don't know, I understand why it's given that a lot of these projects and other people, they're happening at the same time. All of these studies happen to time periods and the customer geography, but really make sense. And so if this kind of existence of mixed race is supposed to be ideally destabilizing place, how come that sometimes that in itself becomes the substitutable way it seems?
I think that's an amazing question. And I'm sorry for everyone online who wasn't able to hear the full thing, but it was about the through line of substitutability through each of the papers. I mean, the only thing that I would add to this is to say that proxy, I mean, what I really think is really interesting about all our papers is the techniques of alignment and making do despite. And I think the promise of a perfect family that is made through race matching is in many ways like a known flawed thing, and yet we commit to it nonetheless, and yet we create these techniques to do it. So same with standardization and standardized man. The same with, I mean, I think yours is probably the only exception insofar.
No, it's not, because that example I showed, the match ended up being a person who would describe himself as white. So
so interesting. I mean, the mixed race itself becomes an identity in itself, despite there would be less correlation between genetically between the people who identify as mixed races. So completely broad and strange. The use of like social media analysis for people to then like align and find each other is also so interesting, I think. So I mean that's the only thing I would say, because sort of this is a known failure. Like race itself is like a known failed standard. And yet these are all techniques of making do and committing to it despite knowing that it wouldn't work. I mean, and that's what the proxy thing is all about, is that we know the world is not computable, we know there are things that we cannot do, and yet we have companies that will promise that they can predict what this customer is going to pick next. They can predict what, you know, the risk profile of this specific person. And we know that they can't do that, and yet they have like these techniques for making do.
Do you want to speak to that, Rose?
no, just the durability of that, the preoccupation with difference in Anne's language, just you know, everyone knows it doesn't work. And yet here we are writing papers about it. So
yeah, I mean, this is the great promise of the age of personalization, is that like these blunt demographics like gender or race should no longer matter, and they should see to other more granular categories such as interested in cupcakes or frequently clicks on yoga related content. Those are like verbatim categories in Facebook that is like we can target people based on these things. And so something like race doesn't matter anymore. And yet you had advertisers that insist on targeting people according to those things. And so this is sort of the great incommensurable moment.
but I guess like what's interesting there in examples like people who like cupcakes, then becomes what are the tastes and practices of particular people. So, or you know,
Yeah,
these
interested
people,
in yoga related content is like the biggest like proxy for whiteness.
right? Yeah, right. It's, you know, it's remarkable, and then but then these become these practices, these tastes become a presumption that you make of a person. And going back to this idea about the mixed subject is like, you know, we're 23% confident, we're 50% confident that they're black because they listen to this, yet they have these practices that are this, which typically a person of a particular color or background would not engage in. And so we're flummoxed. Who is this person? Because they do nothing that's, you know, that maps on correctly to what's happening, to who they're supposed to be. Which makes me think about the idea of an algorithm and transgression, and whether there's space for play in the context of algorithms and proxies, where you can basically game the system and make them think, oh yeah, I'm a South Asian bloke in my 50s, but actually I'm a white girl and I'm 15 and I live in Harrow in London. You know what I mean?
I think it happens all the time, but I also think it doesn't matter. Like the essentialization back to the body makes it's not at all of any matter. Like there's not at all a priority as long as you keep clicking on that content as if you were, as if you were black, you know, as if you were an Asian woman on stage, as if you were a black person on stage. Because money is money. Because money is money, and it doesn't matter what the essentialized sort of, it doesn't, you know, the body is completely divorced from the patterns in that sense. And yet inescapable, because when it comes to something like insurance, all these things become profit. But it just turns out in a settler colony, like everything is a proxy for race. So in some moments they're really inescapable. I really wanted to speak to the point about environments, like from racial identity to racialized environments as well. I think this speaks to that moment in particular. And you know, we're having an interesting moment where we don't have algorithms making it so that we don't see people as like individual racialized subjects, but like clusters of racialized data that are like shifting according to new bits of data that become aggregated, and whenever it's assessing an individual, it's your proximity to others. So again, it's your proximity to the center of the cluster. That's why you're like 75% criminal or 25% trustworthy or 2% share or whatever. But with it, like we have a really interesting moment where like transgression doesn't matter, like all identities are equal if the purpose is to correctly target you. And that's a sort of like what a cybernetic system does. It sort of takes the edge case, it takes the anomaly, it takes what would be a transgression, and it says like, that's fantastic, extra data, thank you so much, I'll be eating that up, and expanding, such that there is no transgressive identity, it's just percentage thresholds of reaching someone.
Great. Is there one last question? From anyone, or does do people want to make a last comment before we go off to our break before the plenary?
I actually have a question for Rose around there was a quote that the racialized recruitment thing I think is really interesting, but you also had a quote around the mixed ethnicity patient of the future of this country. And I wonder if you could speak more to this sort of race of futurity in the nation, because there was sort of a moment where it was like where they use computer CGI systems to like design what would a future stuff of like, and she was this mixed race person. And I would love to know whether that line is coming through with that quote that you brought up.
Big thing, big future, the mixed race subject in the UK, as in a number of global North countries that have a particular history tied to European colonialism. and that have kind of forced and other forms of migration into the country and out of the country. So yes, it is very much a prominent discourse in the UK more broadly, but in the context in which and in the main, I would say that it's a relatively celebrated thing, although there are neuroses certainly on the far right around the kind of as we were talking earlier, Tracy, about replacement theory. In the context of the UK, though, the idea of a sort of a multicultural ideal in which people will come together and form romantic liaisons with people of other ethnic backgrounds demonstrates, you know, that diversity is working, right? So it becomes a proof of our forward-thinkingness in the UK context. But then it also generates this issue in which nobody is a stable racial category anymore. And in the context of personalized medicine, where you need a level of standardization, you then become a problem. And in large number, these very rare people become very, very common, but not to the point where they are themselves becoming a new configuration of the population. You saw them from the admixture paper earlier. Like it's
Right, or in the South African case, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
colored
Yeah.
identity in South Africa, where it becomes a community.
Completely, yeah. And that idea of there being a singular community is then the trouble. So yeah, very much the future, but not necessarily a rosy one in the context of the way that geneticists would frame it. You know,
Well, I think a closing comment on futurity that is not rosy is a very fitting one for this set of panels. So thank you all so much for being with us, and very much missing you, Nadine and Guida, as well. Thank you to all of our speakers. I would like you to join me in a round of applause. And of course, we hope that the conversations continue over the break and into the whole of the conference.
for those online, hopefully you heard that. It was just Nadine and Guita left. Thank you so much for joining us. And have a lovely rest of your day, or probably night. What time would it be for Nadine?
Just a few hours ahead.
Oh, so yeah, that's not too painful. Marvelous. All right. I hope you're well, Nadine. I have no idea what that was in that order.
No.
Yeah, but you found this for that.